Some people arrive at the most important decisions of their lives gradually through argument, persuasion, the slow tipping of evidence until the weight finally shifts. Ruth Calloway had not arrived at hers that way. She had arrived at it standing still on a hillside in the autumn of 1910 with a worn leather notebook in one hand and a piece of charcoal in the other, drawing lines she knew most people would never understand. By the time September of 1912 came around and she stood on that same hillside again, the decision had long since hardened into something past argument. She was not reconsidering anything. She was measuring. The slope beneath her boots dropped steeply toward the valley floor of Harrow Bend, a narrow settlement tucked into the mountains of western Montana, where two ridgelines converged above a creek that ran cold and clear even in the driest summers. From where she stood, the whole town was visible. The row of cabins along the creek's east bank, the timber operation sending its thin column of smoke from the northeast corner, the general store with its hitching rail still empty. At this early hour, the smithy whose chimney had already been burning since before dawn. It was a town built along a single logic: get as close to the water as you can put your house on flat ground, and let gravity and ease make all the decisions for you. Ruth had spent 17 years watching those decisions accumulate. She understood why people made them. Hauling water uphill was genuine suffering. Flat ground made everything easier: laying foundations, running fences, bringing wagons in from the road. Every piece of common sense pointed downward toward the creek, toward the valley floor, where the soil was rich and the wind stayed below the ridgeline most evenings. She had built her first house down there herself in the spring of 1895, side by side with Thomas, the two of them notching logs in the cold April air, while the creek ran loud with snowmelt. That house was still standing. She had sold it 3 months ago and put every dollar into this hillside. From below, she knew that transaction looked like the first sign of a mind beginning to come apart. The morning light moved across the slope above her, across the steep limestone faces that jutted from the northwest ridge, in broken shelves across the wide bowl of accumulated snow, visible even now in September, in the shadows above the tree line. She opened the leather notebook and studied a drawing she had made in the summer of 1910, a rough cross-section of the valley with the creek and the town marked at the bottom, and above them a series of arrows she had sketched in careful sequence, each one following the fall line from the high bowl down through the narrowing chute formed by the two converging ridge lines down the exact path that any significant mass of moving material would travel. The arrows terminated in the valley, at the creek, at the cabins. She closed the notebook. Below, the door of the general store opened and the storekeeper stepped onto the porch with a broom. He looked up at the hillside, saw her standing there, and paused in his sweeping. Even from this distance, she could read the slight tilt of his head, the expression of a man who is either confused or amused, or has decided for convenience to be both. She had seen that expression on many faces lately. She turned back to the slope, pulled a measuring string from her coat pocket, and got on with things. Harrow Bend had existed for 23 years by that autumn, long enough to have acquired the particular permanence of a place that had survived several things that should have ended it: a typhoid outbreak in its 5th year, a fire that took 4 buildings in its 10th, and the quiet departure of the silver mine's primary investors in 1907, which had left the town's economy to reorganize itself around smaller copper claims in the timber trade. It had survived all of these, and its 200 or so residents had developed in consequence the confidence of people who have watched a place endure. They trusted Harrow Bend. They trusted its valley, its creek, its geography. They had seen hard winters come and pass. They had seen the creek flood in spring and recede in summer and freeze to the bottom in the coldest Januaries. None of it had ever come close to ending the town. The people who lived there were for the most part people who had chosen difficulty on purpose. Miners who had followed their veins into these narrow mountains, timbermen who found better wages in the high forests than in the crowded mill towns to the west, a handful of ranching families who ran small herds on the valley's lower meadows. They were not by temperament people who frightened easily. They were also not by temperament people who took well to being told that the place they had built their lives in might one day decide to end them without warning. The town itself ran roughly north to south along the creek's east bank, with most residential cabins clustered between the general store and the smithy. There were 2 streets, if the packed earth paths between buildings deserved the word. A small church at the southern end doubled as a school 3 mornings a week. A rooming house stayed half full in summer and nearly empty in winter. And there was Frank Alderman's hardware and smithy operation, which occupied the largest building in town, a wide, low structure of heavy timber that always smelled of iron filings and cutting oil, where the men of Harrow Bend came not only to have things repaired, but to stand around and discuss the state of affairs in the particular way that men who work with their hands discuss everything directly with strong opinions and without a great deal of patience for uncertainty. Frank Alderman was 52 years old, broad-shouldered, with the forearms of a man who had spent 2 decades at an anvil. He was not cruel and he was not stupid. He was in fact one of the more genuinely capable men in Harrow Bend, reliable, in an emergency fare, in a dispute, the kind of person other people turned toward instinctively when something went wrong. What he was not, and what he would not become for another 2 winters, was a man capable of imagining a danger he had never seen in a place he had learned to trust. Ruth Calloway had turned 64 in July, which meant she had been alive long enough to have made peace with the particular loneliness of being right about things that other people could not yet see. She had been born in Vermont, the youngest daughter of a carpenter who treated woodworking the way some men treated prayer, as something that required your full attention and rewarded honesty above everything else. She had learned to read grain and check for stress fractures in beams before she was 12. She had learned to drive a nail straight, to dovetail a corner, to build things that did not shift when the weight came. Her father had believed with a sincerity that came through in every joint he cut, that a structure either told the truth about the forces acting on it or it eventually confessed its lies and collapse. Ruth had inherited this belief so completely that it had long since stopped feeling like a belief and become simply the way she understood the world. She had met Thomas Calloway at 27 at a church social in Burlington she had attended mainly to please her mother. Thomas was from a logging family in New Hampshire with the particular combination of physical confidence and quiet intelligence that comes from years working in forests where a single miscalculation could kill you. He had been funny in the dry, restrained way of men who have seen enough genuine danger to find most social anxiety ridiculous. He had asked her within 15 minutes of their introduction whether she thought the church roof would survive another decade without rebracing. She had looked up at it, genuinely assessed it, and told him 8 years, maybe 9, if the winters stayed mild. They were married 6 months later. They had moved west because Thomas believed the western timber trade offered better wages than anything in New England, and because both of them, in some way neither fully articulated, wanted more space between themselves and the crowded assumptions of the lives they'd grown up inside. They arrived in Harrow Bend in the spring of 1895, when the town was still young enough to feel provisional, and they built their cabin together that first summer, notching the logs by hand, setting the foundation, stones themselves, building the roof, with a pitch steep enough that Ruth had to argue Thomas into it because he thought it excessive. She had been right about the roof. She was right about most structural things. Thomas knew this, and rather than resenting it, he found it one of the more interesting aspects of being married to her. He died on a Wednesday in February of 1909. A logging sled carrying 3 tons of cut timber broke loose on a frozen slope 2 miles east of town. Thomas had been walking below it. The men who witnessed it said it happened too quickly for him to have had time to understand what was coming. Whether this was true or something they told her to be kind, she had never been certain. What she knew was that she came home from a morning of repair work to find 3 men standing outside her door with their hats in their hands, and that the world from that afternoon forward had a different quality to it. Not emptier exactly, but differently arranged, as though some structural element had been removed and everything remaining had shifted slightly to compensate. She had continued to work. There was no particular alternative. She repaired furniture, built doors, helped with carpentry when people asked, and did it all with the same unhurried precision she had brought to everything since Vermont. She acquired a shepherd dog named Scout from a ranching family whose children had grown and moved east, and Scout's calm, undemanding presence in the cabin became one of the reliable anchors of her daily life. She did not become someone who talked too much about grief, nor someone who avoided it so completely that it curdled into something harder. She simply continued, which is its own form of courage, and she thought about Thomas the way you think about someone you had genuinely known, not as an absence, but as a presence that had taken a different form. It was in the winter following Thomas's death that she first began to think seriously about the slope above town. Not for any dramatic reason. The thought arrived the way most important thoughts arrive sideways through a small door attached to something else entirely. She had been walking the creek bank in early March of 1910, checking ice conditions before the spring melt made the crossing unpredictable, when she noticed what she had walked past before without quite registering the way the bank curved at a particular bend. Not the gentle arc of water finding its easiest path, but a harder compressed curve, as though something had pushed against it from the side with enormous force, and the bank had yielded and never quite returned to its original line. She stopped. She looked at the opposite bank. She looked at the debris line, old and weathered, but still visible, if you knew what you were looking for, running 50 feet above the creek on the valley's western slope, through the aspen stand where the ground was humped and irregular in the way that moving water alone does not make. That was the moment, not loud, not accompanied by any feeling she would have called fear or revelation. Just a thing she understood snapping into focus. She went home that evening, made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and thought about a story Thomas had told her the winter after they moved to Harrow Bend. He had told it the way he told most things, matter-of-factly, without theater, as though the information were simply available and worth sharing. He had been 19 years old, working a timber contract in the mountains of southern Colorado. It had been a heavy snow year, and in late January, after 3 days of warm weather followed by a hard freeze, the snowpack above the work camp had become unstable, in the particular way that develops when a warm interval forms a crust layer beneath fresh accumulation, an ice shelf that sits beneath the weight of newer, heavier snow, like a greased surface waiting for the angle to overcome the friction. He had been awake before dawn, unable to sleep, standing outside the bunkhouse, looking up at the white slope above them, when he heard what he described as a sound like a freight train coming from the wrong direction from above, not from the tracks. He had run. He had been 50 yards from the bunkhouse when it disappeared. 3 men who had still been inside did not survive. He had described the way the avalanche moved, not the chaotic tumbling of loose powder, but a dense, fast-moving mass that swept everything in its path like a wall of compressed force, following the fall line of the mountain, with a precision that made it seem afterward almost deliberate. He had described the marks it left, the way surviving trees bent uniformly away from the direction of travel, the way the stream bank downstream had been reshaped, the way the debris came to rest in a wide fan across the valley floor. He had not told the story to frighten her. He had told it as a fact about the world he had learned at 19 and carried quietly ever since. Ruth had listened to it in 1896 and thought that is something to know. In 1910, standing at the bent curve of Harrow Creek with the westering light on the debris line above her, she thought that is here. She spent the next 2 years looking carefully. Not frantically, not with any outward change in behavior that the town would notice, but with the same systematic patience she brought to any structural assessment. She walked the creek bank in every season, marking the old debris lines in her notebook, measuring their distance above the current water line. She climbed the slopes above town in late summer when the snowpack was gone and the terrain features were fully exposed, and she studied the northwest ridge, the bowl-shaped depression near the top where storms from the west piled their heaviest loads, the steep chute formed by 2 converging faces of rock, the angle of the slope through the width of the valley at the precise point where any sliding mass would reach flat ground and spread its force outward. She sketched cross-sections. She noted the aspect of the slope northwest facing, which meant it accumulated snow during the heaviest storms and received insufficient direct sunlight to consolidate the pack during the moderate intervals between storms. In the late summer of 1911, she found a second debris line older than the first, visible only at the far eastern edge of the valley where a stand of aspen had grown up in an unusual configuration, curved at the base as though all the young trees had grown from rootstock that had been displaced laterally decades before. She sat beside those trees for a long time. They meant it had happened more than once. They meant the interval between events was long enough that no living person in Harrow Bend remembered the last one. They meant that the absence of memory was not the same as the absence of pattern. She retrieved Thomas's brass spyglass from the cedar chest where she had stored his things after the funeral. He had bought it years before from a surveying equipment dealer in Billings, and she had kept it without particular purpose until now. She brought it out without explanation and set it on the shelf by the door where she would not forget it on her morning climbs. She needed one more thing before acting the right location. She had been identifying the requirements for 2 years elevation, sufficient to clear even an exceptional slide. a spur of ground that would deflect rather than directly receive the pressure wave and sufficient soil depth and rock substrate to support the kind of foundation she intended to build. The plot halfway up the western ridge 140 feet above the valley floor met all three requirements. She had walked it 6 times before she was certain. In the last week of September of 1912, she went to find the land agent. Porter, a thin man who handled property transfers from a back room in the general store, confirmed the lot number, confirmed it was available, confirmed the price, $84, kept low because no one had ever wanted hillside ground for anything practical. He asked in the manner of a man who felt some professional responsibility. "Miss Calloway, there's no road access, no flat ground to speak of, and water's a serious haul up that slope. You understand all that?" Ruth set the money on the desk. $84 represented just over 3 years of careful savings from carpentry work and repair jobs, and the occasional larger contract when someone needed genuine structural skill. It represented the largest single expenditure she had made since Thomas's funeral. She watched Porter count the bills, fill out the transfer document, and hand her the deed, and she understood, folding it into her coat pocket, that she had just purchased not only a piece of ground, but the beginning of a season in which a significant portion of Harrow Bend would form a settled opinion about her judgment. By the following afternoon, the transaction had moved through town with the efficiency that small communities achieve without any deliberate effort. Ruth Calloway had bought the hillside lot. Ruth Calloway intended to build up there. The reaction settled into 3 distinct shapes. The first was practical objection. The water problem was genuine. The wind exposure was real. The added labor of hauling everything uphill was not theoretical. Hardship, but daily fact, and these were not trivial concerns in a place where winter already made every task harder than it should be. The second was social bewilderment. The woman with sensible people generally agreed on this, and sensible people did not spend their savings on a piece of hillside that served no discernible purpose. The third, and the one that would eventually become the dominant note, was something more complex and less intentional than mockery. A quiet, slightly sorrowful assumption that a widow living alone with a dog through too many Montana winters had perhaps made the kind of decision that comes not from calculation, but from the slow erosion of reason that loneliness sometimes produces. Not unstable exactly, just no longer quite herself. Frank Alderman found her the afternoon after the deed was recorded, catching her on the path near the store, and his manner was not hostile, but carried the weight of a man who felt some responsibility for the welfare of someone making a visible error. His concern was real. "I've done roofing work at that elevation, and the wind off the northwest face will test any structure you build there. I've seen shingles stripped clean in an hour. I'm not trying to be difficult." Ruth told him she had factored the wind into the design. Frank looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who recognizes a closed door when he encounters one, and then with the small, dry humor of someone who knows when he has lost the argument without winning it. "Well, I suppose your mind's made up." She agreed that it was. The next morning, she began hauling lumber. She worked alone for the first 3 weeks, making 6 round trips daily up the slope with a simple sled she had modified to sit level on uneven ground. The neighbors watched. The path ran close enough to the main road that anyone moving between the residential end of town and the general store could look up and see her small and deliberate, moving at the same pace whether loaded or empty, stopping to rest her back at the halfway point before continuing. Nobody offered to help, in part because it seemed like an enterprise no one wanted to be associated with, and in part because Ruth had not asked, and asking would have changed something essential about what she was doing. She broke ground in the last week of September. The excavation was the most physically demanding part, and also in retrospect, the part that most clearly announced to any careful observer what she was actually building. Instead of clearing the surface and setting foundation posts at grade level the way cabins in Harrow Bend were built, Ruth dug. She cut a rectangular notch into the hillside 4 feet deep and 12 feet wide, going 6 feet back into the slope. At the deepest point, removing the soil in bucket loads and piling it to one side. To anyone watching, it looked like someone digging a cellar before building the house, which was not how it was done. Ruth was digging the cellar first because the cellar was not an afterthought. It was the reason for the location. While she excavated, she sorted stone. The hillside above the building site was interrupted at several points by outcroppings of the gray limestone that formed the ridge's underlying structure. She had assessed these outcroppings during her site surveys and identified which ones could be split and moved without compromising slope stability. Over several days, she worked the stone with a hand drill and wedges splitting slabs of manageable weight, loading them onto the sled, carrying them to the site. By the end of the first week of October, she had enough for the back wall. The back wall went up in a way that confused people who stopped on the trail to look. Most walls in Harrow Bend were log fast to build readily available, serviceable in the local climate if the gaps were chinked properly. Ruth's back wall was 2 courses of split limestone, stacked with rubble filled between them, 18 inches thick, running the full 12-foot width of the footprint and rising to 8 feet. It was set against the excavated face of the hillside, and as it grew, it became clear that the earth behind it was not a problem to work around, but a deliberate element of the structure's design. The soil pressed against the stone from behind. The stone pressed back. The hillside and the wall held each other, and together they formed a single element that neither could have been alone. The 3 remaining walls, 2 side walls, and the front wall facing the valley were heavy log felled from the forest above the site. Ruth used timber significantly larger than standard bottom logs of 16-inch diameter pine oriented with care, so the grain ran in the direction that would carry compression loads most efficiently. The front wall held 2 windows with frames she had built in her workshop over the previous winter, fitted with exterior shutters that locked from inside on heavy iron hasps. The roof was the last element and the one that generated the most sustained attention. When Frank Alderman climbed the slope a second time in late October to see how the structure was taking shape, he stood for a long time looking at the framing before he spoke. The main beams were massive 8 by 10-inch Douglas fir sourced from the timber operation at considerable cost, joined to the top of the stone wall with bolted iron straps that Ruth had fabricated herself. Secondary framing ran from the beams to the ridge plate at tight intervals with diagonal bracing, connecting the wall plate back to a ledger bolted into the stone, creating a triangulated structure of the kind built not to shed ordinary snow loads, but to carry something closer to the weight of the hillside itself pressing down from above. Frank ran his hand along one of the main beams. His expression had moved past mild concern into something harder to name, a reluctant professional attention perhaps, or the discomfort of a man beginning to suspect that a project he had dismissed may involve considerations he hadn't accounted for. His words came out of that discomfort. "You're building this roof like you expect something to land on it." Ruth kept working, fitting a secondary rafter into its notch. "Everything lands on a roof eventually. The question is whether you built it to answer back." Frank was quiet. He looked at the iron straps at the angle of the roof pitch, shallower than the standard, oriented toward the valley, meaning snow above it would build rather than shed. Counterintuitive for a heavy snow climate, unless what lay above the roof was not the primary concern. He left without fully resolving what he'd seen, and the unresolved quality of his departure was in its way more significant than if he'd argued. He returned 3 days later in the early evening when the temperature had dropped enough that each breath was visible. Ruth was fitting the window shutters. She heard him on the trail. She had learned to distinguish his walk from others. The particular deliberateness of a large man being careful on uneven ground, and she kept working. Frank leaned against the unfinished front wall and studied the structure from outside. The back of the cabin had essentially disappeared into the hillside, the stone wall flush with the excavated bank, the removed soil backfilled against the sides, so that from behind the building looked more like a feature of the landscape than anything constructed. Only the chimney in the front face with its 2 windows announced the presence of human intention. His first observation was stated plainly as an engineer rather than a critic. "You're burying half the house." Ruth set down her chisel. "Soil doesn't move in winter. It doesn't contract the way wood does. It doesn't conduct cold the way open air does." She picked the chisel back up. A wall with earth behind it is a different thing from a wall standing exposed. Frank absorbed this. He recognized a sound engineering principle when he heard one, but it still felt to him like a solution to a problem that didn't exist in Harrow Bend. He looked out toward the valley, at the light in the store window, at the thin ice already forming along the quieter edges of the creek, at the comfortable and familiar arrangement of things that had worked well for decades. His words came from genuine confusion rather than unkindness. "I still can't see what you're building away from. The water's down there, the community's down there. You're making every day harder for yourself, and I haven't been able to figure out why." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is not the absence of an answer, but the selection of the right one. Then the creek banks at the South Bend didn't get their shape from water. She let this sit. Frank looked at her. Then what shaped them? Her answer was simple and contained everything: weight coming from above, moving fast. Not recently, but recently enough to still be written in the ground if you know where to read it. Frank looked toward the creek, then toward the ridge above it. He processed what she was suggesting. And then, because he was an honest man, but not an imaginative one, because he had lived in this valley 30 years and seen it survive everything he knew, because the sky above them was cold and clear and entirely still, he made the only judgment his experience allowed. The danger she was describing was theoretical, historical, possibly in a woman who had lived alone too many winters, something that had grown larger in the telling than it was in fact. He picked up his hat from the porch rail. He left her there on the hillside, and as he descended toward town, he was already composing, not with malice, but with the inevitability of a man who has a story people will find interesting, the version he would share the next morning at the smithy. 3 days after Frank's visit, Ruth heard different footsteps on the trail. Lighter, slower, with the rhythm of someone taking their time, not from hesitation, but from the calm of age and genuine deliberateness. Dorothy Sims was 71 years old and had lived in Harrow Bend for 28 years, longer than anyone except old Clarence Webb, who no longer left his house. She was small, dry-looking, with white hair, pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the rest of her face smooth, and she had the quality of someone who had arrived at her opinions through long experience, and was therefore not in the habit of changing them to accommodate new social pressure. She came up the slope without announcing herself, stopped a few feet from where Ruth was working, and looked at the cabin, at the stone wall, at the massive roof beams visible through the unfinished rear section, at the way the structure sat against the hillside, as though it had been fitted rather than built. She did not speak immediately. Ruth kept working. When Dorothy finally spoke, her question bypassed entirely the weeks of debate the rest of the town had been conducting. "Have you seen a fracture line on the northwest face yet this season?" Ruth straightened slowly and looked at her. The question was not casual, and Dorothy's expression confirmed it. She was the only person in Harrow Bend who had asked this specific question, with this specific vocabulary, which meant she had either seen what Ruth had seen or knew enough from her own past to know what to look for. Ruth answered carefully, "Not yet this year, but the banks and the aspens stand on the east slope show it's happened before, more than once." Dorothy nodded in the manner of someone whose suspicion has been confirmed rather than surprised. She spoke of growing up in the mountains of northern Wyoming, of a sliding event that had destroyed her family's equipment barn when she was a girl. Not a famous one, not a large one, by the measures of such things, simply a regular February event on a slope that had been doing the same thing every 8 or 10 years for as long as anyone had recorded. Her father had rebuilt the barn in the same location because the location was convenient, and the next slide, arriving 7 years later, had taken the replacement too. Dorothy had never understood the rebuilding. Even as a child, she had understood that the slope did not care about convenience. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Dorothy finished, she said, "You didn't need to come tell me that. You already knew I'd worked it out." Dorothy's expression moved towards something almost wry. "I came to tell you that some of us aren't laughing, even if we're not saying so loud enough to be heard." She looked once more at the stone wall, the thickness of it, at the earth pressed behind it. Then she made her careful way back down the slope without looking back. It was the most useful conversation Ruth had in the entire season of building. By the 1st of November, the cabin was done. From below in the valley, it was nearly invisible. The earth backfilled against the stone wall blended into the hillside. The roof's gentle forward pitch caught the slope's visual line and continued it almost seamlessly. Only the chimney stack rising above the ridge and the two south-facing windows catching afternoon light indicated that anything occupied the space at all. Ruth had not designed it to disappear. She had simply made every structural decision based on what the building needed to withstand, and the result was a structure that looked from the valley less like something erected on the hillside and more like something the hillside had produced from itself. Inside, the effect of the design was immediate and total. The stone wall radiated warmth with a patience that no log wall could match. Not the variable heat of a fireplace, but a steady ambient warmth absorbed during the hours when the fire burned well and released slowly through the hours when it burned low, evening out the temperature swings that made cold nights in standard cabins dangerous for anyone who was old or sick or simply unlucky. The first night Ruth spent in the finished cabin listening to the wind come off the northwest ridge and hit the front wall at full force while the stone behind her remained simply warm, she felt something she recognized as vindication. Not the loud kind, not the kind that wanted a room to perform itself in, but the quiet and private kind that comes from building something that works precisely the way you intended. Scout settled beside the hearth with the immediate approval of an animal for whom warmth and solidity are the only architectural criteria that matter. The town gave the cabin a name, as small towns give names to things they find confusing. Some called it the burrow. Others used the term that reached Ruth secondhand through the woman at the post office, the mole house. A structure half buried in a hillside built by a woman who had stopped explaining herself to people who weren't listening did look from below like something a burrowing animal would construct. Ruth found the name neither amusing nor wounding. Names people gave to things they didn't understand said more about the gap in their understanding than about the thing itself. November passed. December arrived with a patience that felt almost restrained. Snow fell in the measured way of early winter, accumulating, gradually covering fence lines and woodpile edges and roof ridges in slow increments that Frank's morning shoveling teams managed without difficulty. The creek froze inward from the banks, its moving center channel narrowing week by week. Christmas came and went. The rooming house filled briefly with relatives from Billings and then emptied again. At the general store, the evening gatherings had moved on to newer subjects. Though Frank Alderman occasionally contributed with mild and genuine amusement, the observation that the wind had not yet torn the roof off the mole house, which he offered as both a concession and a continuation of the original joke. People laughed. The winter was easy and the joke was comfortable, and the hillside above town asked nothing of anyone. On the 28th of December, a Sunday, the sky cleared for the first time in 2 weeks and the temperature dropped sharply after dark to 15 below. Ruth had spent the afternoon checking her coal stores, a practice she tracked in the leather notebook, measuring daily consumption against remaining supply, and by 7 in the evening the cabin was at a steady temperature and there was no practical reason to go outside. She went outside anyway. She carried Thomas's brass spyglass and climbed the small rock outcropping 30 feet above the cabin that gave a clean sight line to the northwest ridge. The sky was very clear. The stars were the hard, distinct stars of genuine cold, without the atmospheric softening that moisture brings, and the mountains stood in their night silhouettes, with the ridgeline carved sharp against the sky. She raised the spyglass and found the bowl of the upper snowfield tracked along the face of the northwest ridge, moved the lens slowly and deliberately along the line where the accumulated snowpack met the bare rock above it. She found what she was looking for almost immediately. It was a shadow where no shadow should have been, a faint linear discontinuity running nearly horizontal across the slope, no more than a thin dark seam at this distance, but extending the length of the lens's field before disappearing around the curve of the ridge. A fracture line, the kind that formed when the weight of an accumulated snowpack exceeded the tensile strength of the bonding layer beneath it, when the mass above had made its decision and was being held for now by a sheer plane that had not yet reached the moment of failure. It had not been there 10 days ago. She was certain of this. She lowered the spyglass and stood on the cold rock for a long time, not moving, looking at the dark ridgeline and the pale face of the snowfield below it. The night was absolutely silent, the way that extreme cold makes silence feel like something present rather than merely the absence of sound. Below her, the lights of Harrow Bend burned in their small, confident rows along the creek, every window glowing with the warmth of a place that did not know what was forming above it, that had no reason yet to know, that had been laughing for 3 months at the one person who did. She climbed back down to the cabin. Scout lifted his head from the hearth rug when she came through the door, watching her with the steady attention of an animal that has learned to read a person's movements for meaning. She set the spyglass on the table. Then she added coal to the fire, pulled out the leather notebook, and wrote one line under the date: fracture line, visible northwest face length, undetermined, formed within the last 10 days. She went down to the cellar and checked the food stores one more time, counting the barrels and bags by lamplight, running the numbers she already knew against the numbers she was beginning to think about. Scout sat at the top of the stairs and watched her count. "I know," she said to no one and to him at once. Above the cabin, above Harrow Bend, above all the warm and unsuspecting lights in the valley, the mountain held its silence. For now it held. January arrived with deceptive restraint. The first 3 days of the new year brought 6 inches of dry powder that settled over the frozen creek and the rooftops of Harrow Bend without urgency, the kind of snowfall that children ran into and adults managed with one arm still in their coat. By the fourth day, the sky had lightened enough that men came out to clear paths between cabins without resentment. The temperature held at a workable 12 below cold, but a cold the town had navigated many times before. On the fifth day, the sky did not lighten. It did not do anything so dramatic as darken. It simply became fixed, a low, even featureless gray that sat above the valley like a ceiling pressed down by unseen weight. And from beneath it, the snow that fell was different from what had come before. Heavier, wetter. The kind that accumulated not in the loose negotiable drifts of early winter, but in dense compressing layers that added real load to every horizontal surface it touched. Ruth noticed the difference before she opened the cabin door that morning. She noticed it in the sound, not the whispered hiss of powder snow meeting dry ground, but a dull, muffled impact like something substantial being set down repeatedly. She stood in the doorway for 2 minutes watching, calculating. Then she went back inside and wrote the date in a single observation in the notebook. Heavy wet snow sustained rate wind from northwest quadrant, temperature rising slightly toward consolidation range. That last phrase meant something precise and technical. It described a temperature range in which falling snow, rather than remaining loose and shedding from surfaces, compressed immediately under its own weight and bonded to the layers beneath it. Consolidation range was what you wanted to avoid because it was when accumulated snowpacks stopped being a collection of loose crystals and began behaving as a single mass with tensile properties, with a failure threshold. She pulled on her coat, picked up the spyglass, and climbed to the outcropping. The fracture line was wider. Not by a visible gap, not yet, but by a shadow difference. She could read clearly through the lens, a slightly deeper darkening along the upper edge, suggesting that the plates of the snowpack on either side of the line had shifted minutely but measurably relative to each other. The line itself had extended eastward around the curve of the ridge, which meant it was longer than she had originally estimated. It ran nearly 3/4 of a mile. This was not a fracture forming. This was a fracture that had formed and was waiting. She descended into town for the first time in 4 days. The storm had already begun reshaping the social life of Harrow Bend in the way that sustained weather always did, pulling it indoors, concentrating it at the general store, and the smithy where the stoves burned through more wood than usual, and the conversations grew longer and more repetitive, as the same dozen men worked through the same assessments of how long the storm would last and whether the road west needed attention before the next supply run. Frank Alderman was at the center of this, as he usually was, organizing the snow-clearing rotations and assessing structural concerns across town. He had already been up 2 roofs to check load on the weakest spans. He was a practical man doing practical things, and the practical things were enough for now. Ruth found him at the back of the smithy fitting a cracked plow hitch. She waited for him to finish the weld before she spoke, and when she did, she was precise and unemotional about it. The fracture line on the northwest face had been present for 10 days before the storm began, which meant the storm had not caused the instability. It had found an instability already in place. The new accumulation was adding load to a snowpack that was already at or near its shear threshold. The temperature pattern of the last week, the slight warming on the 26th and 27th, followed by the hard refreeze on the 28th, had almost certainly produced the critical layer configuration, a crust of ice buried beneath fresh, heavy accumulation, acting as a low-friction interface across which the upper mass could accelerate from rest to full velocity within seconds. Frank put down his tongs. He looked at her across the work table with the focused expression of a man running a calculation he didn't expect to like. He had enormous respect for the physics of metals, Simon. Way stress accumulated at weld joints, the way cold made iron brittle in predictable ways, the way structures failed, not at their strongest points, but at the intersections between unlike materials. He understood in his bones the idea of accumulated load reaching a threshold. What he could not fully translate was the scale that a hillside could behave like a weld joint, that a snowfield could accumulate stress, the way a structural beam did, that the comfortable and familiar mountain above his town was not a stable backdrop, but a loaded system. His words came carefully, without the dismissiveness of earlier conversations, but carrying the full weight of a man who had staked 30 years of his own history in this valley. "You're telling me you've been watching this for 10 days and you waited until now?" Ruth did not flinch from this. "I waited until the accumulation of the last 4 days made the timeline real rather than possible. There is a difference between a thing that might happen and a thing that is approaching." Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What are you asking me to do?" She was not asking him to order a full evacuation. She knew the limits of what that request could accomplish coming from her in this town at this moment. What she asked was simpler. Let her speak to any family who would listen. Don't actively discourage them. And if he himself found the case credible enough, send his own family to higher ground. Frank picked up his tongs again and looked at the metal in the fire. He had a wife and 2 sons. He had a business built from 2 decades of daily work. He had a reputation as the most reliable man in Harrow Bend, which meant he had necessarily built that reputation in part on not alarming people unnecessarily. A false alarm would cost him something he had spent years accumulating. He told her honestly and without malice, "I'm not in a position to do that based on what you've described." He looked up from the fire. "But I'm not going to stand in the way of you talking to people." It was the best she was going to get from him, and both of them knew it. She spent the next afternoon going from house to house along the creek's east bank. The storm thickened during those hours, the snow intensifying in the way that storms sometimes do mid-afternoon as frontal pressure increases, and she walked through it with her scarf pulled high, knocking on doors and waiting, then saying what she had to say as plainly as she could. The responses split along the lines she had half expected. At the Pruitt household, Jesse's mother listened carefully and asked 2 precise questions about the fracture line's position relative to the fall line before saying that she would think about it seriously. At the Maddox cabin, the older of the 2 brothers told her she was welcome to her opinion and closed the door without visible hostility, but with a finality that was not an invitation to return. At the Alderman house, she found May rather than Frank. Frank was still at the smithy, which was not unusual. May Alderman was 48 years old with the particular alertness of a woman who had spent many years listening to what was said in a room and also to what wasn't said. She was taller than Frank, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and she held herself with the stillness of someone who made decisions from a place of genuine interior conviction rather than social calculation. She invited Ruth inside without hesitation and listened to everything without interrupting, her eyes steady, her hands quiet in her lap. When Ruth finished, May said nothing immediately. She looked toward the window at the snow coming down now, in thick, fast curtains that reduced visibility to 30 feet, and then at her 2 children playing in the back room, ages 7 and 9, their voices carrying the high, unconcerned music of children who have not yet learned to listen for what adults are not saying. She looked back at Ruth. "If you are right," May's voice was measured and private, although she were thinking aloud rather than performing a statement, "then there is no version of waiting to be sure that ends well for my children." She paused. "And if you're wrong, that I apologize to Frank and half the town for a day, and we all go on." Ruth did not press her. She gave May the exact description of the trail to the cabin and the specific time by which she thought the approach might become difficult if conditions worsened. Then she left. She did not look back. She did not know, walking away from the Alderman house through the thickening snow, whether May would act on the conversation, because some decisions cannot be rushed and some people need to arrive at them in their own sequence without witness. That evening, with the storm fully dark and moving and the wind picking up against the front wall of the cabin, Ruth heard footsteps on the trail. Not one person's weight, the trail sounded different under multiple people, a gathered rhythm. She opened the door before they knocked. May Alderman stood with both children pressed against her sides and a pack on her back that she had clearly loaded quickly with no pretense of casual preparation. She had told no one. She had not left Frank a note which Ruth later understood was not a failure of communication, but a form of protection. If she had written it down, Frank would have had something to argue with before he thought about it. May looked at Ruth across the lamplight threshold, and the look contained the full weight of a woman who has just made an irreversible decision and is standing exactly on the edge of its consequences. "I won't apologize for this until I know whether I need to." Ruth stepped aside and let them in. Scout rose from the rug and approached the children with the calm of an old dog who regards visitors as a mild weather event, and the younger child reached immediately for his ears, and for a moment the cabin held the specific warmth of something ordinary happening inside something that was not at all ordinary. Frank Alderman discovered his family was gone 2 hours later. He came to the smithy door, looked up the slope toward where Ruth's two front windows were faintly visible through the snow, and stood for a long time in the cold. The light from those windows was small and steady, and the snow between him and them showed the recent marks of feet. He went back inside and did not sleep much. But he also did not climb the trail that night to retrieve his family, which was perhaps the most honest thing he did during the entire winter. By morning, the storm had been running for 6 days. The snow-clearing rotation had become an almost continuous operation, teams of men working in shifts because the volume of new accumulation now exceeded what any ordinary morning session could handle. Drift lines had buried the first-floor windows on the creekside cabins. The road west had not been passable for 3 days. The mood in town had shifted not to panic, but to the sober, focused attention of people who are managing something that is genuinely demanding their full resources. Jesse Pruitt, 24 years old and the strongest man in any immediate vicinity, by simple measurement, had been working double shifts on the clearing crews without complaint, because this was how Jesse met most things: by physical engagement, by putting his body between a problem and the people around him. He was the kind of young man who does not think about courage as an abstraction because he has never needed to. It is simply the direction he moves when movement is required. He had taken seriously what Ruth told his mother. He hadn't told anyone this. On the morning of the seventh day, the snow stopped. Not gradually, it stopped between 1 minute and the next, and the sky, which had been an undifferentiated gray mass for nearly a week, opened into a sharp, painful blue from the northwest. The light that came through the opening was the particular saturating light that follows storm systems. When the air behind the front is so clear, it seems to add intensity rather than merely allow passage. It hit the fresh snowpack and exploded into a brightness that made everyone who stepped outside squint and shield their faces. People came out of their cabins. Children were the first, then women shaking blankets from doorways, then men who had been listening to the quiet with the evaluative attention of those who had been waiting for it. Voices carried across the snow with unusual clarity in the still cold air. Someone laughed a real laugh, the kind of release that comes when a sustained pressure is removed, and the sound of it moved through town and caught and spread. And for 15 minutes, Harrow Ben was simply glad. Ruth heard the storm stop from the cabin doorway. She heard the voices in the valley below, the laughter, the doors opening. She heard Scout moving restlessly behind her. She had been awake for most of the previous night, not from anxiety, but from the particular vigilance of someone waiting for a specific condition, the way a doctor stays awake not from worry, but from the understanding that a change, when it comes, requires immediate attention. She climbed to the outcropping before the valley's celebration had fully unfolded. What she saw through the spyglass ended any remaining uncertainty. The fracture line on the northwest face had opened. Not by much, not yet a gap visible to the naked eye from the valley, but through the lens the shadow difference was now an actual offset. The upper plate of the snowpack had dropped 4 to 6 inches relative to the lower face. The mass above the line was no longer simply unstable. It was in motion. Not visible motion, the kind of motion that would announce itself that people could run from if they saw it, but the slow, inexorable motion of a system that has passed its threshold and is accumulating the momentum that will, within hours or less, become catastrophic. She came back down and moved fast. Frank was outside the smithy when she found him squinting up at the cleared sky with the relieved expression of a man who had navigated his crew through a difficult stretch and was allowing himself a brief moment to breathe. She reached him in 8 strides and told him clearly, without preamble, the fracture line had opened. He needed to look at the northwest face right now, and he needed to understand that what had been a potential event was now an active one. Frank looked at her. The expression on his face moved through several stages in a compressed second. The residual comfort of the cleared sky, the authority of experience, the memory of his family sleeping in her cabin up the hill, and then something that cracked through all of it, a cold and genuine attention. He looked up toward the northwest ridge. The snowpack above the valley looked still, white and enormous, and still, the way it always looked, the way it had looked every winter of his life in this place. There was nothing visible to the naked eye. but he was a man who worked with metal under load, who knew that a beam does not look different in the final seconds before it fails than it looks an hour before that. The visible signal comes with no warning that the fracture is internal, and the external evidence arrives only at the moment of completion. He looked at the slope and felt for the first time what Ruth had been carrying alone for 2 years. Start at the southern end of the creek, both sides. His voice had dropped to something quiet and completely unambiguous. Tell every family to get up the hillside now, not with their things, without their things, move fast. He was already turning, already calculating who was where, already doing the thing he was genuinely good at. He called out to Jesse Pruitt across the yard. The warning moved through Harrow Bend in the concentrated, strange way that warnings move in small towns, where everyone knows which voices to listen to when those voices become serious. Frank's voice was serious. Jesse ran. May, who heard the commotion from a quarter-mile up the hill and saw the running through the cabin's south-facing windows, pulled the children from where they were playing and positioned them at the cabin door and told them with absolute calm that they were staying very close to her and not moving unless she said to move. Some people responded immediately. Some people went back inside for things. Some people stood in the cleared paths between cabins and looked up at the mountain and saw nothing, and struggled to understand why they were being told to run from something that was not yet visible. The mountain gave them its answer 37 minutes after the storm stopped them. The sound arrived before the sight, a low, sustained vibration that came through the ground rather than the air felt in the feet and the legs before it was heard in the ears, the kind of sound that registers in the body at a frequency below the threshold of casual attention, but above the threshold of survival instinct. People who were still inside felt it in their floors. People who were already running felt it add itself to their legs as they climbed. Jesse Pruitt, 2/3 of the way up the trail with an elderly couple he had physically turned away from the road west, felt it travel from the packed snow beneath his boots up through his entire frame and understood with total clarity what it meant. He looked back once. The northwest face of the ridge was moving. The entire upper snowfield, a mass so large that no individual part of it could be taken in at once from below, had separated along the fracture line and was descending. Not in the slow sequential way of ice calving from a glacier, not in the separate rolls and tumbles of a small slide, but as a single cohesive mass in its first moment of release, still nearly intact, traveling the steep upper face with a gathering speed that the geometry of the chute would translate within seconds into something beyond correction. The air ahead of it pushed outward and downward like a wave front, flattening the lightest remaining snow from the surface as it went. Then the mass hit the narrowing of the chute between the two converging ridge faces, and the front broke apart into the dense, churning, white surge that anyone who had ever seen what followed would recognize as the true form of the event. Not snow falling, but snow becoming something temporarily structural and completely lethal, moving through the valley's geometry with the specificity of something following a prepared course. The first cabin disappeared in under 3 seconds. No drama in the structure's end, no suspended moment, no resistance. The walls separated at the base and the roof descended, and the whole configuration was absorbed into the moving mass and carried forward as undifferentiated material. The second and third cabins followed in the same merciless sequence, and then the surge reached the widest part of the valley floor and spread laterally, which slowed it, but gave it a breadth that swept the creek bank clean in both directions for the length of the town's residential stretch. The sound was physical, not the sound of destruction, which implies individual impacts, but a single prolonged compression of air that pressed against the chest and the ears, and though the atmosphere itself were changing state. Jesse did not look again. He climbed. Frank Alderman was at the top of the trail when the first wave hit the valley. He had been running back for a family he'd seen still in their doorway, had gotten them moving, had turned them uphill with both hands, and sprinted behind them. And he reached the beginning of the slope's safe elevation, just as the surge passed beneath him, close enough that the pressure wave knocked him sideways into the drift at the trail's edge. He stayed down for 2 seconds, then rose and kept moving, counting the people ahead of him on the trail, trying to hold the number in his mind against the chaos of the moment. Dorothy Sims had not been able to run. She had understood this about herself before the morning began, and when the warning reached her, she had gone outside, looked up the trail, assessed the distance, and made a clear-eyed determination about what was possible. Jessie found her standing in the middle of the road with her hands folded and her chin raised, watching the ridge with an expression of someone who has outlived her surprises. He did not argue with her and did not explain himself. He simply put her on his back. She weighed less than 100 pounds and climbed. She gripped his coat with both hands and did not make a sound during the ascent. They came up the trail in a crowd that numbered, by the time Ruth counted them across her threshold, 43 people. Some barefoot, having been caught inside without boots within reach. Several in sleeping clothes under hastily seized coats. One young mother with a child on each hip and nothing else. They arrived in the compressed, urgent way of people who have outrun something real, not simply cold and frightened, but carrying the specific aliveness of those who have just been reminded with total finality that aliveness is not guaranteed. Ruth stood in the doorway as she had stood before May's arrival the previous night, but now the scale was entirely different. She looked at the people arriving up her trail, at Frank's face, which was doing the kind of rapid inventory that keeps a man from sitting down in shock, at Dorothy being set down carefully from Jesse's back, at the children who had not yet understood the full measure of what they had just survived. And she made decisions in the same sequence that her mind always made decisions, structural first. The cabin's interior was 400 square feet. The lean-to she had built against the front wall the previous summer for tool storage was another 80 square feet, weathertight on 3 sides, with the cabin's front wall as its fourth, not warm but windproof, which was survivable with enough bodies generating heat. She had canvas in the storage corner. She had rope. She had the tools to extend the lean-to's coverage laterally by another 20 feet within 2 hours if she had hands to work with. She put Jesse to work on the lean-to extension. Within 15 minutes of arrival, the two of them cutting canvas and lashing it to a frame of spruce poles from the woodpile, while the first of the families organized themselves inside. She assessed the cellar ventilation and opened the interior hatch to let warmth rise from the thermal mass of the stored earth below. She checked the flue for draft adequate, not excellent, and banked the fire to a steady medium burn rather than a hot one. High heat would draw oxygen faster and fill the cabin with carbon monoxide before anyone recognized the danger. She had thought about this before in the abstract as a design consideration for emergency occupancy. Now it was immediate. The first hour was simply managed chaos. People were wet. Some were injured, abrasions and bruises. Up from the trail, one man with a shoulder wrenched from a fall, Jesse's hands cut from the lean-to construction in the cold. May organized the interior with the same quality of practical intelligence she brought to everything: children nearest the hearth, elderly and wet people next, able-bodied adults assigned tasks or positioned to wait productively. She did not ask Ruth's permission for any of this. She simply did it, and Ruth observed her and understood she had an ally of precisely the kind the next days required. Frank came to Ruth when the first organization had been achieved, when the noise level had dropped from crisis to management. He was the kind of man who needed to account for everything. So his first question was logistical: food and water. How long could she supply 43 people? She took him through the cellar trap door. The lamp threw yellow light across the shelves, and Frank counted what the light fell on with the expression of a man simultaneously reassured and still calculating. The quantity was real: barrels of dried beans, sacks of flour, salted meat on hooks, potatoes stored in sand, dried corn cooking. Oil, the careful arrangement of exactly the supplies a person preparing for an isolated winter would need. It was a serious, thoughtful food store built not for dramatic effect, but from the knowledge that a single woman living alone at elevation with the road potentially closed for months needed genuine reserves. He looked at the shelves for a long time. His voice was quiet. You did all of this. Ruth held the lamp steady. Over 2 years, I added to it every season. Frank turned to look at her directly. How long does this last us? Her answer was plain and without comfort or false reassurance. If we ration from the first meal, 18 to 20 days. If we find ways to supplement from the debris field once it's safe to approach, possibly longer. He looked back at the shelves. 20 days was not winter's end. 20 days was February. 20 days was the beginning of the real accounting. They climbed back upstairs without speaking. The decision to ration was obvious and unpopular and necessary, and Frank announced it that evening as people settled into the space they had been assigned. Nobody argued. The avalanche was still present in everyone's body, in the residue of adrenaline, in the specific kind of mental quiet that follows survival An argument required a kind of energy that nobody currently had to spare. The first night, Ruth managed the fire in 3-hour intervals, sleeping between checks. She kept the interior temperature at a number she had calculated cold enough to reduce carbon monoxide risk, warm enough to prevent cold-related illness in the children and older occupants. She moved through the crowded space with a lantern, stepping around sleeping bodies, checking the ventilation gap she'd cut in the upper front wall, 2 inches of open crack that she monitored every pass, adjusting it by a 1/4 inch against the wind direction to maintain adequate airflow without excessive heat loss. By 4 in the morning, the cabin smelled of damp wool and wood smoke and the particular closed warmth of many bodies in a small space, and Scout had retreated to the cellar stairwell, which was the warmest and least crowded spot available to him. The routine that formed over the following days had the quality of survival routines, not comfortable, but workable, sustained by the collective understanding that the alternative to the routine was the absence of alternatives entirely. Frank organized the wood-gathering teams with the same competence he brought to any operational task, 4 men in the morning working the forest above the cabin, where the avalanche had not reached, cutting and hauling deadfall back along a tramped path. The work was brutal in the cold, which had settled back to 15 below after the storm cleared, and the men came back each morning with red faces and raw hands in the particular satisfaction of people who have done something concrete in a situation that otherwise offered little purchase for agency. Jesse Pruitt worked harder than anyone, which was partly physical capacity and partly the psychological disposition of a young man who manages fear through movement. Ruth observed him during the first 5 days without comment, the way he gauged other people's needs before his own, the way he modified his behavior when children were nearby, becoming quieter and more deliberate. She had worked beside men of his type before, the kind that apprenticed well, if anyone thought to teach them. She had not thought to begin that conversation yet. There would, she suspected, be time. Dorothy Sims did what she had apparently always done in difficult situations. She sat near the center of whatever room she was in and became a point of reference, not through advice or instruction, but through simple presence, the particular gravity that an elderly person with visible equanimity generates in a frightened community. Children went to her naturally. Adults found themselves talking to her without having planned to. She listened with the complete attention of someone who has nothing left to prove and therefore nothing to manage in the listening. On the 12th day, Jesse climbed to the high rock above the cabin in the early afternoon when the light was at its best angle. He had borrowed the spyglass not to check the ridge that threat had expressed itself completely, but to assess the debris field in the valley below. Ruth was splitting kindling near the cabin's front wall when he came back down. He did not speak immediately. He handed her the spyglass, then described what he'd seen. The avalanche debris field across the valley floor was massive, but it was not uniformly deep. At the edges of the main deposit, where the surge had been losing momentum as it spread laterally, some of the taller structures had not been fully engulfed. Roof lines were visible in 3 locations, broken and compressed in some cases, but visible, which meant the upper portions of those buildings had not been fully collapsed by the initial wave, which meant the spaces below, protected by the roof lines above them, might contain materials that were accessible. Ruth looked through the spyglass at the indicated positions. She recognized the roof line of the building at the south end of the residential stretch by its chimney profile. That building had been the Marsh household. Clara Marsh had kept the most organized food storage of anyone on the creek bank. She had mentioned it once in passing during a conversation about winter preparation that Ruth had participated in 2 years ago, and that Clara had treated as general conversation rather than specific warning. Ruth lowered the spyglass. The debris field between the cabin's position and those roof lines was a landscape of compressed and refrozen avalanche material, chaotic, unstable in places, with the particular danger of buried voids, where the surge had passed over standing objects and left hollow spaces beneath the surface. A person who stepped into one of those voids without warning would drop through the surface into a potentially unrecoverable position. The field was also still capable of secondary settling. A large section of the original mass had not fully consolidated, and any significant disturbance near the center could trigger localized collapse. She spent an evening planning the approach with Frank and Jesse. They drew it on the back of a flour sack with a piece of charcoal, working from Jesse's observation and Ruth's knowledge of the town's layout. They identified 3 approach vectors that minimized exposure to unstable zones, calculated rope lengths, assigned positions in the descent team. They designated a primary rescue signal, 2 sharp axe strikes on a tree trunk, and a secondary abort signal, which was simply the lead man's raised fist, visible to the anchor team above. Frank and 4 other men prepared the following morning. Jesse insisted on leading not from bravado, but from the straightforward logic that he was the fastest and most physically capable, which made him simultaneously the most able to navigate the terrain and the best equipped to recover from a mistake before it became something worse. Ruth checked his rope harness twice, not because she doubted his ability to tie it, but because the check was her job, and she did it thoroughly regardless. They descended in late morning when the light was direct and the surface slightly softened by midday temperature. The approach to the first roofline took 40 minutes of careful, deliberate movement, each step tested before weight was committed. The rope team maintaining tension from the anchor point, the spacing between men wide enough to prevent a single void collapse from taking 2 people. They reached the first accessible roofline, the marsh house, as Ruth had identified, and worked for 2 hours with axes and bare hands cutting through the exposed sheathing and digging down through packed snow to the structure below. What they found in the attic space was less than they had hoped and more than they needed. 4 sacks of flour, a wooden case of canned goods, 2 sealed tins of cooking, lard, a canvas bag of dried apples. Enough to extend the rationing timeline by several days. They hauled it up in relay, and the return ascent took longer than the descent, loaded and climbing, but everyone arrived at the top intact, and Frank's count of bodies on the rope line came up correct. The second expedition 2 days later went to a different roofline. It also returned with food. The morale effect of these recoveries was disproportionate to the caloric value of what was found. Something about the active retrieval of resources from the site of the disaster gave people the experience of agency in a situation that had otherwise reduced them entirely to waiting. Frank noticed this and noted it to himself without comment, filing it in the same internal register where he kept observations he would think about more carefully once time permitted. The third expedition went wrong on its 22nd minute. Jesse was 6 feet ahead of the nearest team member, testing the surface of a section that looked consolidated, but that his instincts developed across 4 years of working in conditions where instincts were structural, information told him might be variable. He was correct about the variability. He was incorrect about the specific location of the margin. His left foot went through the surface crust to the shin, then the surface around the breech gave way, laterally dropping his entire left side into a void space that turned out to be a collapsed barn alcove buried 6 feet under the debris surface. The rope caught him at the waist. The drop was 5 feet before the rope went taut, which would have been manageable except that the edge of the void was not clean. It was the broken timber and frozen metal of the barn's upper frame and the impact of the rope stopping. His fall swung him against this edge with enough force that 2 ribs on his right side gave way with a sound like green wood splitting. The team hauled him up in 17 minutes. He did not lose consciousness during the ascent, which told Ruth something about his pain threshold that she filed alongside the other information she had been accumulating about him. He was breathing in the short, controlled rhythm of someone managing acute pain through deliberate regulation rather than shock. By the time they reached the cabin, he had blood on his scarf from a gash above his right eye, and he was running a gray pallor that came from the combination of cold and blood loss and the muscular effort of keeping his breathing controlled despite broken ribs. May had hot water at the hearth before they came through the door. Ruth washed and closed the gash with 3 strips of cloth soaked in the cooking alcohol she kept for exactly this category of medical event. She bound his ribs with torn canvas strips tight enough to stabilize without compressing his lung expansion. Dorothy Sims held the lamp steady throughout without being asked. The rest of the cabin was very quiet in the way that a room full of people becomes quiet when the person being treated is someone the room has come to rely on. Jesse lay back against the wall after it was done breathing carefully. May handed him a cup of thin soup, and he wrapped both hands around it. His voice came out compressed and rough. "I found the Pruitt flour store on the way down. It's in the far northeast section under maybe 4 feet of consolidated material. 2 barrels. I saw the edge of the lid." Nobody responded for a moment. Then Frank made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob and was both. Ruth looked at Jesse for a moment, then turned back to the fire. He would need 5 days of rest before he could be useful again in any capacity that involved his upper body. The flower would wait. Everything that mattered in a situation like this waited for the person who was going to go get it. Jesse recovered as he did most things steadily, without complaint, with a kind of deliberate engagement that turned the enforced stillness into its own form of preparation. By the second day, he was sitting up. By the fourth, he was doing one-armed work near the hearth that kept him from going entirely still. Ruth gave him things to do with his hands fitting notches, checking rope for fraying tasks that needed precision more than strength. They talked during these hours not about the storm or the slide or the long weeks ahead, but about construction, about why the stone wall worked the way it worked, about the principle of building into terrain rather than on top of it, about the difference between a structure designed around convenience and one designed around force. Jesse listened with the specific attention of someone who has recently encountered at close range an example of what happens when structure fails under load, and who intends to carry the lesson forward rather than past. On the 23rd day, the temperature fell to 45 below zero. Ruth knew it before she looked at the thermometer mounted outside the door. She felt it in the behavior of the fire, which suddenly demanded more fuel to hold the same output, and in the sound of the cabin's logs, which began the particular creak of wood contracting under extreme cold. The stone wall behind the hearth was doing what it had been built to do, absorbing excess heat during the burning hours and releasing it through the cold hours. But 45 below was a different equation than the temperatures the winter had produced until now. At 45 below, the differential between the inside and outside air was sufficient to begin drawing warmth out of the stone itself. She did the calculation quickly. The coal supply had been managed carefully, but carefully was not the same as fully adequate for this temperature at this occupancy. She had two choices: burn more coal and exhaust the supply in 2 days, or change the geometry of what she was heating. She called Frank, explained the physics, and told him what they were going to do. Within 20 minutes, the cabin had been reorganized by collective effort into its smallest functional configuration. All 43 people moved to the half of the room nearest the stone wall, where the radiated heat was highest, compressing the occupancy into roughly 200 square feet. The front half of the room, the windows, the door, the lean-to side, was abandoned to the cold. The fire was moved to its lowest sustainable burn. Bodies did the rest. The night lasted a very long time. Dorothy Sims sat against the stone with her eyes closed, and whether she was praying or simply present, it produced the same quality of stillness in the people around her. Frank Alderman held his wife's hand in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about things with the uninterrupted honesty that extreme conditions sometimes make available. The children slept with the unconscious trust of children who have not yet learned to assess the full range of what is at risk when adults around them go quiet. Ruth fed the fire in careful increments, measuring each addition by feel and by the wall's response, maintaining the equilibrium by a margin that was real but not comfortable. At 4 in the morning, the wall was warm. All 43 people were breathing. At first light, Frank put on every piece of clothing he was wearing and slipped outside to assess conditions. The cold hit him in the face like something structural, not weather but force, the kind of cold that removes the concept of gradual. He walked the perimeter of the cabin by habit, checking the drift lines against the walls, the integrity of the lean-to, the load on the main roof still holding the beams, doing exactly what Ruth had cut them to do. He walked to the south side of the cabin, where the slope fell away most steeply toward the valley below. He stopped. Beneath his feet, somewhere under the 4 feet of consolidated snow pressed against the cabin's south foundation, he heard something. Not wind, not settling timber. He went down to one knee and pressed his ear directly against the packed surface, the cold burning instantly through the fabric at his cheek, and he held very still. The sound came again, rhythmic, deliberate. 2 strikes, a pause, 2 strikes. The pattern of something conscious and intentional coming from below the snow, coming from the direction of the old marsh cellar structure that he knew from the recovery expedition had not been reached. He stood up and looked at the hillside for 1 full second. Then he turned and went through the cabin door and said Ruth's name, and she was already awake, already looking at him, and his voice came with the clarity of a man who has moved entirely past uncertainty. "There's someone alive under the south field." Frank did not wait for the others. He went back through the door, picked up an axe from the tool rack beside the entrance, and returned outside in the same motion, and Ruth was already pulling on her coat as the door swung shut behind him. She came out 30 seconds later with two shovels and the longer of the two rope coils from the supply corner, and by the time she reached Frank, he had already dropped to his knees on the packed surface and was pressing both palms flat against the snow, feeling for the vibration that his ear had found. Jesse appeared in the doorway, saw what was happening, and despite the bound ribs and the careful breathing of the previous 5 days, he stepped forward without asking anyone's permission. Ruth looked at him once at the set of his jaw, at the controlled way he was holding his torso, and made the decision that a woman who understood force loads could make. He would dig with one arm dominant, and she would take the heavy side. She handed him the shorter shovel without discussion, and they began. The snow over the south field had the particular density of material that had been wet, frozen partially consolidated, and then deep frozen again. Not the airy accumulation of a standard drift, but something closer to soft stone requiring the shovel blade to be driven in rather than scooped. Frank worked alongside them and two other men came out from the cabin, within minutes drawn by the sound of digging, in a situation where sound still carried the authority of emergency. Ruth directed the excavation angle based on what she knew of the Marsh property layout. The cellar entrance had been on the northwest corner of the building, which meant the accessible void space. If it had survived, the pressure of the debris load above it would be roughly 8 feet below the current surface and slightly east of their starting point. She was working from memory of a building she had entered twice in 17 years, under 3 feet of overburden and chaos, and she was precise about the uncertainty of the calculation, without letting that uncertainty slow the shovels. At 4 feet down, the character of the material changed. The compressed debris gave way to something more irregular, broken timber mixed with snow ice, the structural remnants of the upper floors absorbed into the flow. This was expected. It was also the most dangerous layer because the voids within it were unpredictable, and the weight above them was real. Ruth told Jesse to slow, and he slowed without protest, shifting to hand clearing, where the shovel could not be controlled finally enough. Frank mirrored the change in approach, and the two men at the surface kept the removed material moving up and away through the growing shaft. At 6 feet, Ruth's shovel struck wood that did not give not the soft, fractured wood of a collapsed wall, but the hard resistance of something still bearing all load. She worked the shovel edge along its length and cleared enough to reveal a plank surface running horizontal, a floor beam still in place, meaning the structure below it had not fully compressed under the avalanche's weight. The void was real. She called up to the surface for the rope to be lowered and tied the end to the beam as a reference anchor, then continued clearing around its edge. The sounds from below had stopped. The cessation of the tapping lasted long enough that Frank looked at Ruth and she looked back at him with an expression that said what neither of them said aloud, that the silence might mean the person below had expended their last reserve in the effort of being heard, or it might mean the cold had done its final accounting in the interval between the signal and the rescue. Either answer required the same next action. She kept digging. The floor beam gave them an edge to work around, and at 7 feet the shovel blade broke through into open air. Not much a gap, the width of a hand, but the air that came through it was warmer than the air above, which meant the space below was thermally active, which meant something in it was still producing heat. Ruth pressed her face to the gap. "Can you hear me?" Her voice went down into the dark and came back as the echo, and then from a direction slightly east of her position as something else entirely. A voice, rough, spent but organized, "Two of us." The digging became faster and more deliberate simultaneously, a difficult combination that everyone present managed without instruction because the information had clarified the stakes in the most direct possible way. 20 minutes later, the gap was large enough to lower the lantern. Its light fell on a cellar space that had survived almost intact, protected by the floor structure above it and by the hillside foundation wall on its north face, which had absorbed and distributed the lateral pressure of the debris field without collapsing. In that space, seated on the floor with their backs against the surviving foundation wall and a shared wool blanket across both their laps, were Harold Sims and Clara Marsh. Harold was 19 years old and had been in the Marsh cellar retrieving a jar of preserves for his Aunt Dorothy when the mountain moved. He had felt the vibration in the cellar floor 3 seconds before impact, enough time to press himself into the north corner beside the foundation wall and cover his head. The cellar door above him had been driven shut and compacted by the debris load, which had sealed him in as effectively as deliberate construction. Clara Marsh had been in the cellar for a different reason. She had gone down that morning to assess her provisions before the storm cleared, and the cellar door above had been locked from below by the same compaction that trapped Harold. They had found each other by sound then, by the light of a single oil lamp that Clara kept on the cellar shelf, and they had been managing that lamp with the precision of people who understand that light in their situation was the same as time. The lamp had gone out 6 hours ago. They had been in complete darkness since then. The hole was widened to the point where Ruth could lower herself through it. She went down without drama, assessed both people with her hands, and a quick visual survey by lantern light determined that Harold had frostbite at 3 of his left fingers from an early period when he'd been pressed against the foundation wall before fully understanding the thermal management problem, and that Clara, who was 38, a practiced and sensible woman in ordinary circumstances, and something close to extraordinary in these ones, was cold and dehydrated and had been unconscious once briefly in the last 4 hours, but was now fully present and considerably angry in the specific way of a person who has survived something through sheer force of will and would like the world to acknowledge this. Ruth told her directly, "We heard you, you did the right thing." Clara's voice was as raw as dry wood. "I knew someone would listen if I kept hitting." She had been using the heel of a broken jar lid to strike the underside of the floor beam every 30 seconds for the last 14 hours, resting in 10-minute intervals before the silence of the last 6. Getting both people out through the shaft was a slow and careful process that took another 40 minutes. Harold came first, guided up by rope around his torso, hands above the injured fingers to protect them. He emerged into the white air of a Montana morning at 43 below zero and immediately began crying, which was the correct physiological response and required no particular management beyond getting him inside quickly. Clara came second, and when she cleared the top of the shaft and felt Frank's hands close on her forearms and haul her to the surface, she made a sound that was neither crying nor laughter, but something prior to both the raw exhalation of a body that has been holding itself at the edge of its limits for a very long time and has just been allowed to release. They moved quickly to the cabin. Ruth went last, closing the shaft behind her with a tarpaulin weighted at the edges, both to prevent collapse and to retain the possibility of returning for whatever remained of Clara's stores in better conditions. Dorothy Sims was standing when they came through the door. She had been standing since Frank had woken the room with his news, and she remained standing while the others organized themselves around the arrivals. And when Harold was brought to the hearth and the blankets came off him, and he looked up and saw his aunt across the crowded room, the expression on his face cycled through relief and shame and love in a sequence so rapid and unguarded that several adults in the room who were watching looked away to give it privacy. Dorothy crossed to him in the slow, deliberate way of a very old woman who is moving faster than her body prefers because something more important than comfort is required. She sat beside him and placed one hand on the back of his neck, the way she must have done when he was very small, and she did not speak, and Harold did not speak, and the room made itself quiet around them in the way that a room full of people will sometimes do when it recognizes that what is happening in one corner of it is the most true thing currently occurring anywhere. Ruth stood near the door and watched this, and she felt the particular fullness of a moment that required nothing from her, no assessment, no calculation, no management. She let it be what it was. Clara Marsh recovered her heat and her composure within 2 hours, both with a directness that said they had never been genuinely gone, only compressed by circumstance. She sat near May Alderman, and the two women spoke in the quiet, efficient manner of people taking inventory after a crisis, what was lost, what was not, what the coming weeks would require. Clara had practical knowledge about what was in her cellar and where it was positioned, and she shared this with the precision of someone who had organized it herself and was therefore its most reliable map. The information she provided about her flour and preserved goods, taken with what Jesse had glimpsed from the field before his injury, gave Frank a revised picture of the supplementary resources available in the debris field. It was not abundance, but it was enough. The second rescue expedition went out 4 days later when the temperature had risen 12 degrees and the surface conditions had settled enough for two-man teams to approach safely. It was methodical and careful and resulted in no injuries and 3 substantial recoveries, and the cumulative food supply was extended by a margin that, when Frank did the accounting, carried them to early March without extreme rationing. The mood in the cabin crossed a threshold that nobody marked explicitly, but everyone felt, from the managed fear of people surviving by narrow margins toward the different quality of people who have stabilized their position and can begin to look past the immediate day. Jesse healed as young men with strong constitutions heal ahead of schedule and slightly ahead of prudence, which required Ruth to be specific and firm about what he could and could not do before the ribs were fully knitted. He accepted her assessments with good humor and complied with them more thoroughly than she had expected, which told her that the compliance was not deference but genuine judgment. During the days when he was required to be still, she taught him. Not with instruction manuals or formal lesson, she worked within reach of where he sat and described what she was doing and why, connecting each action to the principle behind it in the manner of her father, who had believed that skill was not technique, but understanding expressed through technique. Jesse listened the way a person listens, when the information is not academic, but immediately relevant to what he has already lived through, and she found him in return asking questions that started with the practical and pushed toward the structural, toward the why beneath the what. Frank watched these exchanges during the long evenings without inserting himself into them. He was doing his own processing during this period, a slower, more internal reckoning than the physical work of the day permitted, conducted in the particular hours after the cabin quieted and before sleep arrived. He had spent 30 years as a man whose authority and harrowbend derived from experience and physical competence and the accumulated trust of people who had seen him solve problems. His identity was not fragile, but it was specific. He knew what he knew. He was honest about what he didn't know, and he had built his life at the intersection of those two territories. Ruth Calloway had been operating in a territory he hadn't known existed, using tools he didn't have, and she had been right. The gap between those facts and his earlier certainty was a distance he was covering slowly, as honestly as he could, without pretending the distance was smaller than it was. He found the maps on a Sunday in mid-February when May asked him to look for extra tallow candles in the drawer of Ruth's work table, and he opened the wrong drawer. The leather notebook was there, the worn one Ruth had been carrying since before he could remember seeing her without it, and beneath it, folded carefully, a series of larger pages that unfolded to reveal the cross-sectional drawings Ruth had made across 2 years of systematic observation. The fall line diagrams, the debris markers on the creek bank dated and measured, the aspect calculations for the Northwest Bowl, the arrow sequences that traced the exact path a moving mass would travel from the bowl through the chute and across the valley floor. At the bottom of each page, a date, the earliest from 1910, the latest from the August before the storm. He sat down at the work table with the pages spread before him and read them in sequence slowly, in the way that a man reads something that is rewriting what he thought he understood. The craftsmanship of the analysis was as clear to him as the craftsmanship of her construction. He could see the patience in it, the methodical accumulation, the way each observation built on the previous one without jumping ahead of the evidence. He could see the long, solitary discipline of a woman who had been carrying this knowledge for 2 years with no reasonable expectation that anyone around her would believe it until it was too late to matter, and who had built the only response available to her anyway. He was still at the table when Ruth came back in from her morning exterior check. She saw the maps on the table. She did not say anything immediately. She pulled her coat off and hung it on the hook and went to the stove to check the temperature by the feel of the flue pipe. Frank looked up from the drawings, and his voice was carefully level. "You started this in 1910. Ruth confirmed this without turning. 3 years before anyone knew there was a problem to be solved. She turned then and looked at him from across the work table, and her expression held neither victory nor reproach, only the settled quality of a woman who had spent 3 years being the only person in possession of a particular fact and was now simply in the company of someone else who had it. Frank looked back at the maps, at the arrows converging on the valley, at the careful dates at the bottom of each page. He folded them precisely along their original creases and set them on top of the notebook. "I'm going to keep these." His voice was not asking to remember what I was too certain to see. Ruth did not argue. She turned back to the stove. The cold persisted through the rest of February with the relentless quality of a Montana winter that has not yet received any signal to alter course. But the days grew measurably longer, first by minutes, then by increments, that began to feel like accumulation. The sun, when it appeared, stayed higher in the sky. The shadows off the ridge fell shorter. By the last days of February, the snow on the south-facing slopes nearest the cabin had begun to show the faint blue undertone that indicates internal temperature change rather than surface effect, the early physical sign of snowpack beginning to shift from winter density toward the first stages of melt. Children noticed it first as children notice these things, a change in the quality of light through the cabin windows, the way the late afternoon sun no longer faded into gray, but held a faint warmth against the front wall that could be felt if you pressed your palm there. The mood change that followed was not dramatic or sudden. It arrived the way spring itself arrives in mountain country, not as an event but as a direction, a tipping of the balance from one sustained condition toward another, incremental enough that you could not identify the single moment it happened, but could look back from any point and see clearly that it had. Clara Marsh, who had been usefully occupied throughout the survival period and had shown a talent for practical organization that nobody had expected, because nobody had previously asked it of her, began talking about her cellar. Not the part of it that had saved her life, the structural fact of it, but the principle, the way a room dug into the earth had held its temperature within survivable range, while everything above it was destroyed. She said this to May first, and May said it to Frank, and Frank wrote it in the margin of one of Ruth's maps with a stub of charcoal earth holes. In 3 months of living inside the physical proof of this principle, he had felt it daily and was now ready to name it. Dorothy Sims spoke to Ruth one evening in the third week of February, seated side by side on the bench Ruth had built into the south wall below the windows, watching the last of the day's light fade from the snowfield above the cabin. Dorothy had the quality that extreme age sometimes confers, a willingness to say clearly what she had thought about at length without softening it for social comfort. Her voice was dry and direct. I think you already know that most of what Harrow Bend decides to rebuild will look different from what the slide took. Ruth considered this. Different because they have no choice, or different because they understand something now? Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Both. The people who survive something real don't get to pretend they didn't. The first morning in March, when the temperature outside reached 20 above zero rather than 20 below, was not ceremonially different from any other morning, but people registered it in their bodies as something distinct. Frank organized the first full group outdoor gathering since the avalanche, all 45 people. The 43 who had come through the cabin door, plus Harold and Clara, assembled on the south slope in the cold, bright air and looked down at the valley below. The debris field was still almost fully covered, its enormous dimensions visible only by the flatness it imposed on the landscape, where the valley's natural contours had been the creek banks, the woodline, the outlines of structures. Harrow Creek itself was running again along its eastern margin, the meltwater from the debris field's surface finding the old channel and following it, and the sound of moving water after months of silence carried the particular authority of something that cannot be stopped by anything that has happened above it. Nobody made a speech. The gathering was not for speeches. It was for the act of standing together above what had been lost and looking at it in daylight, which was a different thing from processing it individually in the dark of the cabin. Frank stood at the edge of the group and looked at the place where the smithy had been gone entirely, not even the roof line remaining, the building too close to the central path of the surge, and he held the loss of it without trying to diminish or accelerate what that holding required. May stood beside him. Harold stood with his arm around his Aunt Dorothy, supporting her weight on the uneven slope without making the support obvious. Jesse stood slightly apart, looking at the valley with the measuring attention of a young man beginning to see it as a problem to solve rather than a catastrophe to mourn. Clara Marsh was the first person to ask a practical question out loud. Which part of the valley is safe to rebuild in? Every face turned toward Ruth. She had expected this and had been thinking about the answer for 3 weeks. Not in the sense of deciding what to tell people, but in the sense of deciding how to explain what the terrain could tell them if they were willing to read it. She walked the group along the south-facing ridge to a point where the valley's geometry was visible in its entirety, and she talked for 20 minutes without notes pointing to the fall line's path and its boundaries to the sections of valley floor that had been inside the surge's main corridor, and those that had been at its lateral margins to the elevation thresholds above which the debris field thinned to a depth that structural rebuilding became viable. She talked about setback distances and foundation depth and the value of partial earth shelter for ground floor walls. She talked about roof pitch and load calculation in the specific terms that her father had used in Vermont and stripped of unnecessary complexity, grounded in what was physically true and therefore non-negotiable. People listened, not with the polite attention of an audience enduring an explanation they don't need, but with the focused silence of people who have just spent 3 months inside the only building that those principles had protected. The rebuilding began in April when the snowpack had thinned enough for teams to work the lower slopes safely and the creek had settled from its early melt surge into its spring channel. The pace of work was slow at first. People were still weak from the winter, still regaining the physical reserves that months of limited food and extreme cold had drawn down. But it was steady and it carried the particular quality of work that people do when they understand both why it is necessary and how it should be done. Ruth spent the first weeks of the rebuilding season moving between work sites, not directing, but being available, answering questions as they arose, checking structural decisions, catching errors before they were built in. She did not soften her corrections. She did not harden them either. She simply told people the accurate thing, and by this point in their collective history, accurate was the only currency anyone in Harrow Bend was still interested in trading. Frank built his new smithy on the lower hillside 30 feet above the old site's elevation, with its north wall dug 18 inches into the slope. He dug the foundation himself over 3 days, working with a deliberateness that those who watched him recognized as something more than labor, as a man physically enacting a change in how he understood his work. The north wall, when it went up, was stone for the lower 4 feet and timber above. He told anyone who asked that it was a practical decision about thermal mass and wind resistance, which was true. He did not add the other truth, which was that every course of stone he laid was a specific act of acknowledgement placed without ceremony in the wall of a building he intended to stand for the rest of his life. Jesse did not return to the mine. This decision, when he made it, was not dramatic. It simply became clear to him over the course of the spring that the work he had been doing at Ruth's work table and on her construction sites during the long winter weeks had rearranged something in how he understood his own capacities, and that returning to the ore tunnel would be a deliberate choice to go backward past a point he had moved through. He went to Ruth in May and told her directly what he was asking, which was whether she would take him on as an apprentice for a full building season. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluative attention she gave to structural questions, and then, "You already know how to work. What I can teach you is how to think about what the work is for." He accepted this as the yes it was. The first house Jesse built with minimal oversight was a 2-room structure for the Pruitt family positioned on the middle hillside where Ruth had marked the safe building zone. He dug the foundation to the depth she had specified, set the stone course for the lower walls, as she had shown him, and framed the roof with the braced construction she had taught him during the winter hours. When it was finished, Ruth walked through it and ran her hands along the beam connections and checked the wall plates and looked at the roof framing from inside with the lantern held high. She said 2 things: that the east wall plate connection needed a second bolt at the midpoint, and that the rest of it would stand for 50 years if the maintenance was kept. Jesse added the bolt that afternoon. He did not discuss the compliment, because in the working vocabulary Ruth had been building in him over 6 months, a structure that would stand for 50 years was not a compliment. It was a description of adequate work correctly performed. Clara Marsh rebuilt her house with a cellar twice the size of the original one. She hired Jesse to dig it and frame the access, and she supervised the stocking of it herself with the focused attention of someone who had spent 33 hours in a dark hole underground and arrived at a set of conclusions that were not negotiable. She told May Alderman, while they were both helping carry storage jars down the cellar stairs the week before winter, that she had decided the cellar was not preparation for a disaster. It was preparation for the fact that disasters don't announce themselves by category. You prepared for the cold, and the cellar also saved you from the slide. You prepared for the slide, and the preparation also kept you warm enough to survive the winter after it. Preparation was not specific. It was a way of taking the future seriously enough to act in the present. May wrote this down on the back of a seed catalog that evening, and it was in the informal way that words sometimes pass through a community and become part of its shared language, the phrase that people in the rebuilt Harrow Bend most often used when explaining to newcomers why the town was built the way it was. By the autumn of 1913, 9 months after the avalanche, the new Harrow Bend had taken a shape distinct enough from its predecessor that travelers coming through occasionally stopped to look puzzled, by the way the buildings ran along the hillside rather than the valley floor, by the stone lower walls, by the unusual roof configurations that emphasized load capacity over aesthetics. A land surveyor passing through in October wrote in his professional journal that the settlement showed an uncommonly sophisticated application of terrain-aware construction principles, and that whoever had designed the rebuilding layout and appeared to have a thorough understanding of slope stability and avalanche mechanics. He did not ask who was responsible. If he had asked, the answer he would have received from any resident of Harrow Bend would have been the same: a woman named Ruth Calloway, who had built her house on the hillside before anyone knew why it mattered. Ruth did not attend the informal gatherings that accumulated around the rebuilding's progress, not because she was excluded, but because attendance at social acknowledgments of her own contributions had never been the thing she was working toward. She went to work sites when work needed doing. She went to the general store when she needed supplies. She went home to her cabin in the evenings and sat beside the stone wall that had held warmth through the worst of it, and Scout Old, now moving slowly, sleeping longer, settled beside her with the undimmed approval of an animal whose criteria for a good life had been consistently met. 7 years passed. The specific weight of the winter of 1913 became in the way that genuinely formative events become less of a memory and more of a substrate. Something that was present in the way people made decisions and organized their houses and talked to their children about the mountains without it being necessary to name it every time. The rebuilt town had grown back to near its original population by 1917, drawing new residents partly by the same economic factors that had built it initially, and partly by a reputation passed through the informal channels by which reputations travel as a settlement that had survived something catastrophic and rebuilt in a way that showed it understood why. In the autumn of 1917, Scout died. He went quietly the way old dogs go, when they have been genuinely cared for, in the warmth of the hearthside with his head on Ruth's hand, and she sat with him through the evening and into the night, the way you sit with something you have been grateful for and are grateful for, still even as it goes. She buried him on the slope above the cabin under a flat limestone marker. She cut herself, and the next week she was back at her work, because that was what there was. She got a new dog from a family in town whose sheepdog had whelped in late September. The pup was brown and serious and still working out the implications of the world. Ruth named him Thomas, which was what she had always been going to name the next dog, and he adjusted to the stone cabin and the hillside life with the immediate ease of an animal who has found the right situation before it knew it was looking. In the spring of 1920, Frank Alderman Carman came up the hillside on a Thursday afternoon carrying a folded newspaper under one arm and a small paper-wrapped parcel that turned out to be 2 pieces of dried apple cake from May, who had taken to sending things with Frank when he visited as a form of participation in conversations she was not physically part of. He was 59 years old and moved up the slope with the deliberateness of a man who takes slopes seriously now, in a way he might not have when he was younger, and Ruth heard him on the path and opened the door before he knocked. They sat at the table with the cake between them and coffee in tin cups, and Frank unfolded the newspaper and set it in front of her. It was a Missoula paper 4 weeks old with a front section article about construction practices in mountain settlements following a study conducted by engineers from the State Agricultural College. The article discussed several communities that had been rebuilding after weather events, flooding in one county, a mine subsidence in another, avalanche damage in a third unnamed settlement, and the building adaptations that had emerged from each. Midway through the piece, in a paragraph about terrain-aware foundation practices, there was a sentence referencing a rebuilt Montana settlement where the residents had adopted hillside construction principles developed by a local carpenter following the avalanche of 1913. Ruth's name appeared once in the final sentence of that paragraph in a subordinate clause. She read the article at the pace she read everything, completely without skipping. When she finished, she folded the newspaper along its original creases and set it on the table. Frank watched her. She looked at the folded paper for a moment, then pushed it back toward him. The principles in there are sound. The attribution doesn't change them. Frank held the paper and looked at her across the table, and he had the expression of a man who has stopped trying to give someone something they have never needed. His voice carried 8 years of a changed understanding. You built it before you needed it to save anyone. You built it before anyone believed you. And you built it right. Ruth picked up her coffee. Through the south window, the valley of the rebuilt Harrow Bend lay visible in its afternoon light, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, The creek catching the sun, the buildings arranged along their hillside tiers, with their stone lower walls and their reinforced roof lines. She looked at it for a moment with the particular attention of someone who has had a long time to consider the distance between what a place was and what it became. She set the cup down. Thomas the dog raised his head from the rug and looked at her, then lowered it again, with the settled confidence of an animal who has assessed the room and found everything in order. Frank stood to go. At the door, he stopped without turning around. I want you to know that the way this town is built, the way all of it came out, that's yours. Ruth's voice came from across the room, quiet and final, as the last entry in a logbook. The town is everyone's. The preparation was mine. The storm made them the same thing. He went down the slope. Above him, the cabin sat in its place against the hillside, half inside the mountain and half facing out its heavy beams overhead, and its south windows open to the afternoon light, exactly as it had been built, exactly as it would remain. And on the ridge to the northwest, as it always did and always would, the snowfield was beginning its quiet accumulation for the season ahead. The mountain would load again. It always did. Ruth Calloway had understood this before anyone else in the valley, had built her answer into stone and timber and earth, and had waited with the patience of someone who builds not for the approval of the present day, but for the truth of the one that is coming.